September 13, 1985. A conference room in Oxford, England. The Saudi oil minister, Ahmed Zaki Yamani, stood before an audience of energy officials and made an announcement that would echo through history. Saudi Arabia was done playing nice. They were about to flood the world with cheap oil. To most people in that room, it sounded like a business decision, a market adjustment, a negotiating tactic. But in the Kremlin, 3,000 miles away, it sounded like a declaration of war, because the men in Moscow knew something the Oxford audience didn't. The Soviet Union was a junkie, and oil was its drug, and Yamani had just announced he was cutting off the supply. This is the story of how one man, with one decision, brought down a nuclear superpower. It's not a story you'll find in most history books. There are no tanks, no missiles, no armies marching across borders. This is a different kind of warfare, economic warfare. And it was devastatingly effective. Ahmed Zaki Yamani wasn't a general. He wasn't a spy. He was an oil minister, a lawyer by training, a man who wore fine suits and spoke perfect English. But in 1985, he became the most dangerous man in the world to the Soviet Union. Not because of what he said, but because of what he controlled. Saudi Arabia sat on a quarter of the world's oil reserves, and Yamani controlled the tap. Before we dive into how one decision by one man triggered the collapse of an empire, hit that subscribe button and the bell icon so you don't miss the rest of this story. And drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing our global audience. Now, let's get back to 1985, to the moment when economic warfare changed the world. To understand how Yamani destroyed the Soviet Union, you first need to understand who he was and what he represented. Ahmed Zaki Yamani was born in Mecca in 1930 into a family of Islamic scholars. His father was a Grand Mufti, a respected religious authority. But young Yamani didn't follow the religious path. He studied law at Cairo University, then earned a master's degree from New York University, and later studied at Harvard Law School. He was brilliant, sophisticated, multilingual, and politically astute. In 1962, at just 32 years old, he was appointed as Saudi Arabia's Minister of Petroleum and Mineral Resources by King Faisal. It was a shocking appointment. Yamani wasn't from the royal family. He wasn't a geologist or an oil expert. He was a lawyer. But King Faisal saw something in him, a strategic mind, a skilled negotiator. Someone who could transform Saudi Arabia from a middling oil producer into an energy superpower. And that's exactly what Yamani did, throughout the 1960s and 1970s. Yamani orchestrated the nationalization of Saudi oil assets, wresting control from American oil companies like Exxon, Chevron, Mobil, and Texaco. He didn't do it through violent seizure like other oil-producing nations. He negotiated, slowly, methodically, patiently. By the 1980s, Saudi Arabia controlled Saudi Aramco, the company that would become the most valuable corporation on earth. Yamani became the face of OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. He was, quite literally, Mr. Oil. When he spoke, oil prices moved. When he made decisions, economies trembled. But Yamani had a problem in the early 1980s, a problem that would set him on a collision course with the Soviet Union. Other OPEC members were cheating. The cartel had agreed to limit production to keep prices high. Everyone was supposed to stick to their quota, but countries like Iran, Iraq, Libya, and Nigeria were pumping more oil than they were supposed to, selling it cheaper, and stealing Saudi Arabia's market share. Meanwhile, Saudi Arabia was playing by the rules, cutting its own production to prop up prices. Saudi oil output had plummeted from over 10 million barrels per day in 1980 to barely 2 million barrels per day by 1985. The kingdom was sacrificing billions of dollars in revenue to maintain the OPEC price floor while everyone else cheated and got rich. King Fahd, who had ascended to the throne in 1982, was furious. He didn't understand why Saudi Arabia should be the world's swing producer, cutting production to benefit cheaters, while Yamani was dealing with OPEC's dysfunction. The Soviet Union was becoming dangerously dependent on oil revenue. In 1965, Soviet geologists discovered the Samodler oil field in western Siberia, one of the largest oil discoveries in history. It was a sea of black gold throughout the 1970s. As OPEC drove oil prices from $3 a barrel to over $35 a barrel, the Soviet Union became fabulously wealthy. Billions of dollars in hard currency flooded into Moscow. Oil and gas exports became the lifeblood of the Soviet economy, accounting for the vast majority of their hard currency earnings. By the early 1980s, oil revenue was funding everything: the military, the space program, food imports, subsidies for satellite states in Eastern Europe, and the war in Afghanistan. But here's the critical detail. The Soviets weren't using oil money to fix their broken economy. They were using it to hide the fact that their economy was broken. Soviet factories were inefficient. Soviet agriculture was a disaster. The collective farm system was so dysfunctional that the nation couldn't feed itself despite having some of the most fertile farmland on Earth. So they bought grain, millions of tons of it, from the United States, their archenemy. By the mid-1980s, the Soviet Union was spending nearly half of its hard currency earnings just to buy American wheat. Think about the absurdity of that. And nuclear superpower, selling oil to buy food from the country it was locked in a Cold War with. The entire Soviet budget was balanced on one assumption: oil would stay expensive. As long as oil was above $30 a barrel, the system worked. The moment it dropped, the empire would be in trouble. And in Washington and Riyadh, people were starting to notice this vulnerability. The Reagan administration had been looking for ways to pressure the Soviet Union without direct military confrontation. National Security Advisor Robert McFarlane and CIA Director William Casey saw the opportunity. Oil prices could be crashed. The Soviet Union would hemorrhage money. They would have to choose between funding their military, feeding their people, or maintaining control over Eastern Europe. It was economic strangulation. But the United States couldn't crash oil prices alone. They needed Saudi Arabia. And that meant they needed Yamani. The exact details of the coordination between the United States and Saudi Arabia remain partially classified, but the broad outline is clear. Throughout 1985, there were discussions at the highest levels. The Reagan administration wanted low oil prices for two reasons. First, to cripple the Soviet economy. Second, to help the American economy by reducing energy costs. Saudi Arabia had its own reasons to want lower prices. King Fahd was tired of subsidizing OPEC cheaters. If Saudi Arabia flooded the market with cheap oil, it would punish the countries that were breaking their quotas. It would also bankrupt high-cost oil producers in the North Sea, Alaska, and other non-OPEC regions, forcing them out of the market. Once the competition was destroyed, Saudi Arabia could cut production again and prices would soar. It was a calculated gamble. Yamani understood the stakes. He knew that crashing oil prices would hurt Saudi Arabia in the short term. Revenue would plummet, the budget would go into deficit, but he also believed it was necessary to discipline the oil market and restore Saudi Arabia's dominance. What's less clear is whether Yamani fully understood the geopolitical implications. Did he know he was about to kill the Soviet Union? Did the Americans tell him explicitly that this was economic warfare against Moscow? Or did Yamani simply see it as a market correction that would coincidentally benefit American foreign policy? We may never know the full truth, but what we do know is that in September 1985, Yamani made his move. At a seminar at Oxford University, he confirmed that Saudi Arabia was abandoning OPEC's official pricing structure. The kingdom would start selling oil on a netback basis, meaning the price would be tied to the market value of refined products. In practice, this meant Saudi Arabia would sell oil cheaper than anyone else. The Saudis would also ramp up production dramatically, flooding the market. It was a declaration of war on high oil prices. The impact was immediate and catastrophic. January 1986, oil was trading at around $27 a barrel. By March, it had dropped to $15. By July, it crashed to $10 a barrel. In less than a year, oil prices had fallen by more than 70%. For oil exporting countries, it was a bloodbath. But for the Soviet Union, it was an existential crisis. Mikhail Gorbachev had just become General Secretary in March 1985. He had big plans for reforming the Soviet economy through his program called Perestroika, restructuring. He wanted to modernize Soviet industry, invest in technology, and make the economy more competitive. To fund these reforms, he needed money, lots of it. He had built his entire budget around the assumption that oil would stay at $30 a barrel or higher. When oil crashed to $10, the Soviet budget imploded. In the span of a few months, the empire lost more than half of its hard currency income. Tens of billions of dollars simply evaporated. It was as if someone had cut off the Soviet Union's salary but left all the bills the same. The mortgage, the car payment, the credit cards, everything was still due. But the money was gone. Gorbachev was stunned. His economic advisors were in a state of panic. The reform plans were dead on arrival. There was no money to invest in modernization. There was barely enough money to buy grain. The Soviet Union faced an impossible choice. They could cut military spending, which would enrage the generals and invite a coup. They could cut food subsidies, which would put people in the streets protesting. Or they could borrow. They chose to borrow. Western banks, particularly German, French, and British institutions, were happy to lend. After all, this was a nuclear superpower with a perfect credit history. They had always paid their debts. They had gold reserves. Surely they were a safe bet. So the loans flowed. Billions upon billions of dollars. But this wasn't investment capital. This was survival money. The Soviets were borrowing just to buy food, just to keep the lights on, just to avoid immediate collapse. They were living on credit cards. The debt exploded. From nearly zero foreign debt in 1985, the Soviet Union owed over $50 billion by 1989. And the interest payments were crushing them. By 1991, they were borrowing money just to pay the interest on previous loans. It was a death spiral. As oil prices stayed low throughout the late 1980s, the Soviet system began to unravel. The government started printing rubles to cover budget shortfalls, which triggered inflation. Store shelves emptied. The famous Soviet shortages became even worse. People stood in line for hours just to buy bread or soap. The black market exploded. The ruble became worthless. People hoarded dollars, cigarettes, anything with real value. The social contract between the Soviet state and its citizens was breaking down. For decades, the Soviet people had tolerated the lack of freedom because the state provided stability, cheap housing, guaranteed jobs, subsidized food. But now the stability was gone. The money was worthless, the shelves were empty, and the promises were broken. Meanwhile, the satellite states in Eastern Europe were watching. Poland, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Hungary. They all saw that Moscow was broke. The Soviet Union could no longer afford to prop them up financially. And more importantly, Moscow could no longer afford to send in tanks to crush rebellions. When the Berlin Wall fell in November 1989, Gorbachev didn't send troops, not because he was a peaceful reformer at heart, but because the Soviet Union couldn't afford another military intervention. They were bankrupt. By 1990, the Soviet Union was defaulting on commercial payments. Ships carrying food to Soviet ports refused to unload their cargo because the checks were bouncing. The government was begging Western nations for humanitarian aid. A superpower that had defeated Hitler and put the first man in space was now asking Germany for food donations. Here's the bitter irony. Yamani's decision destroyed the Soviet Union. But it also destroyed Yamani's career. The oil price crash hurt Saudi Arabia badly. Government revenues collapsed. The kingdom ran massive budget deficits. There was anger in the royal family. King Fahd had supported the strategy initially, but as the pain dragged on, he turned on Yamani. In October 1986, just a year after the Oxford announcement, King Fahd fired Yamani. No warning, no ceremony. Just a terse announcement. After 24 years as oil minister, Yamani was out. The official reason was that Yamani had failed to convince OPEC to agree on production quotas. But the real reason was simpler. The oil price war had worked too well. It had crashed prices so low that even Saudi Arabia, with its low production costs, was bleeding money. The royal family needed a scapegoat, and Yamani was it. Yamani would later say that the decision to flood the market was not his alone. It was approved by the king. But in the end, he took the fall. He moved to London, founded a consulting firm, and lived quietly until his death in 2021 at the age of 90. In interviews, Yamani would reflect on his role in history. He didn't express regret about the 1973 oil embargo, which had quadrupled prices and triggered a global recession. But he did express regret about OPEC's attempts to manipulate prices in the years that followed. He believed the market should determine oil prices, not cartels. And yet, he had spent his entire career as the most powerful man in the most powerful cartel in the world. As for the Soviet Union, the collapse that Yamani's decision accelerated created chaos that lasted for years. Russia inherited the debt, all $65 billion of it, throughout the 1990s. Ordinary Russians suffered through hyperinflation, poverty, and economic collapse. Entire life savings were wiped out. The social safety net disintegrated. Crime exploded. Oligarchs looted state assets. It was a catastrophic transition. Russia didn't finish paying off the last Soviet-era debts until 2017, when they made a final payment to Bosnia-Herzegovina. 26 years to close the books on a dead empire. The fall of the Soviet Union teaches us that, in the modern world, economic power can be more decisive than military power. The Soviet Union had 40,000 nuclear warheads, millions of soldiers, tanks, submarines, and intercontinental ballistic missiles. None of it mattered when they couldn't pay for bread. Ahmed Zaki Yamani never commanded an army. He never fired a shot. But with one decision in September 1985, he set in motion a chain of events that would end the Cold War and redraw the map of Europe. It's a reminder that the global economy is a weapon. Oil prices, currency values, trade relationships, debt. These aren't just abstract numbers on a screen. They're instruments of power, and in the right hands, or the wrong hands, they can bring down empires. Today, Saudi Arabia still wields enormous power in the oil market. Russia rebuilt itself on oil revenue in the 2000s, only to face the same vulnerability all over again whenever prices drop. Venezuela, Iran, and other petrostates have learned, or failed to learn, the same lesson that the Soviet Union learned too late. If your entire economy is built on a single commodity, you're not rich. You're vulnerable. You're one price crash away from collapse. One decision by one man in one room can change everything. Yamani once said, "The Stone Age did not end for lack of stone, and the oil age will end long before the world runs out of oil." He understood that power is temporary, that markets shift, and that empires built on resources are always fragile. In September 1985, he proved it. He opened the taps, flooded the world with oil, and watched as a nuclear superpower slowly bled out. Not from war, but from bankruptcy. And that's how one Saudi prince destroyed the Soviet Union. If this story showed you a side of history you've never heard before, hit that subscribe button. Drop a comment and let me know what you think. Could this happen again? Are there countries today vulnerable to the same fate? Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.